Hi, I'm Kayne Naughton. I am the Managing Director at Cosive. I come from a vulnerability development, sysadmin, and then more recently, I guess, doing threat intel into the financial sector background. I'm one of the co-founders of Cosive. We started in 2015, and we specialise in trying to solve the difficult problems for Australian and New Zealand organisations. Unfortunately, and this might be a little bit of a contentious view, but a lot of people, their security strategy is a shopping list. It's like one of those, hotted up turbocharged cars. You've got the little list of you say to people, what's your strategy? And you're like, we're going to buy one of this, we're going to buy one of that, we're going to put it all in this SIEM tool, we're going to use this for orchestration. And it's not a strategy or a plan, but ultimately you need to know what you're planning on defending against and how good your current defenses are and what the delta is in order to be able to actually do something about it. And unless you know what's going out there in the world, you're getting led by salespeople or marketing to know where you think you should be focused, and that's not necessarily accurate. Threat intel was a bit of a thing that was pushed by everyone not that long ago, same as like machine learning or doing security on the blockchain or whatever else. You end up chasing fads, and quite often it's product focused, whereas if you go back to fundamentals and you look at the risk against organisations like your own, if you find something that's happened to someone like you, either in terms of they're geographically like you, they're in a similar sector, they're of a similar size, if you can find out what happened to them, what worked, what didn't work, then you can go, okay, so how would we be suited to defend against this? Is there a particular new type of attack or defense that we could do? And quite often that stuff's cheap in terms of expenditure. It can be manually expensive in terms of effort. Like if you said we'll get rid of every externally facing remote desktop login from all of our Windows servers. There won't be any of them facing the internet. It doesn't require buying a blinky light machine. It's going to involve a lot of pain in terms of finding all the right areas and making them change to a better business practice, but it also massively reduces your chance of getting ransomware if someone has a bad password. Getting rid of local administrator, if you look at sort of commonalities between various attacks, they ultimately somehow get onto a machine and then they escalate their privileges. If people are running as a local administrator, then that's really easy. Those sorts of things, even just what you do about antivirus alerts, all of these things that you can help inform with threat intelligence mean that you're actually focusing what's going to matter most likely to you. And it's not a science. It's they call it tradecraft with intelligence, and it ultimately it is. It's not an art. It's not a science. It's sort of somewhere in between. But it can be quite opinionated. But it's looking at what's happening over the horizon to try and prepare yourself for what you're seeing now. A lot of people, and I tend to be of a mind to treat it somewhat strategically. I think a lot of people have a focus on finding, I guess, very precise, but also not terribly long-lasting, what I call a brittle thing, like an IP address. If you get a report from 6 months ago from attacking someone else, and you'll go, oh, okay, here's what we've learned about it, is this IP address is used by the attacker. Like, by all means, look back at your logs from 6 months ago and see if you're seeing it. But if that's what you're relying on for current detection, like, why would the attacker be using the same address from 6 months ago? It's just ridiculous. You don't need to. It's so much cheaper and easier just to have another system at that point. It's, you might see overlap if you're in the same campaign as somebody else at a previous time, but realistically, looking at the way that they attack, the types of tools that they use or the techniques that they use, ultimately, the TTPs, the tactics, techniques, and procedures that they use, those are things that you can learn from. But a lot of people drill down that a little bit too close and are looking at the exact specific, what is the exact tool and the exact version that they used. Okay, have we seen that? What this IP address or this domain name? They need to sort of zoom out a little bit if they're actually going to learn something from it. There's a few things that people fall into. Firstly, I guess priorities. If you've got multiple priorities, you don't really have any priorities. It's an expensive activity to go into, which is something we often warn people. And it usually involves your generalist staff who can do a bit of everything. And then they tend to be the ones who get drawn into other things that are deemed to be a high priority at the time. And quite often, intel doesn't get done because they're busy sort of scrambling to deal with something that the board wants to know about, or an investigation or a SOC uplift. The idea of, I think, collecting particularly sort of low-grade indicators like hashes and IP addresses and so on, and then keeping them forever and having a giant list of every phishing site the world's ever seen somewhere that you're matching against, and then, having an alert occur whenever someone goes to a site that was maybe, or a domain that was used to host a phishing site 4 years ago, but is now a florist website or something still. Those types of things tend to wear people down. You need to be able to downgrade your reliability or applicability of different types of things depending on, like a phishing site is 2 weeks after it was a phishing site, that you might want to know that it matches just so you can sort of exclude it, or it might provide some context, but you don't want to be freaking out and sounding an alarm. Yeah, so being careful what you provide through to people and having the ability to age things out is definitely very useful. Just generally context, particularly when you're dealing with technical indicators. This is a trap I see all the time from sort of centralized, be it sort of government, police bodies, whatever else. When people put out advisories, they'll say, have a description of, here's a bunch of text about things that have been going on, and then they'll have an appendix which is a giant list of files or IP addresses or other odds and ends, and the context of those particular things is not always clear, and nearly universally there'll be like some sort of public VPN endpoint or something that was included in there, that it's the context that would make it an indicator of badness depending on a period of time and a couple of other things, whereas just saying, this particular port number, it might be bad, it might be perfectly normal. It's going to make people freak out if they don't understand that. You need to be able to sort of provide the context rather than just, here's 7 different addresses. You need to sort of give a time window or a why, because the idea of things being good or bad, it's always depending on time, but there's also degrees of, is this just annoying? Is it just janitorial, you should clean this stuff up, like computer hygiene? Or is it, oh no, panic, call the CISO? And if you're providing threat intel to people without that information, that means that people end up spinning their wheels, particularly if you're a trusted entity, because how do you, someone gets this from you, you might have it as a bit of a low fidelity thing that you think people should look for, but because of you being the source, they're going to panic if they see it. So that's definitely one for people sort of facing externally, more so with technical things. The other big one is for internally, where you can totally blow your credibility, is if you end up sort of going all Chicken Little and you stamp your feet and say that, the organization must patch this within 24 hours or the sky will fall, we're doomed, we'll be bankrupt, that's it, it'll just be nothing but, we'll basically level to the car park, because you can get away with that once, but if nothing happens, your credibility's shot. You can't sort of throw your weight around. You need to sort of say, you wouldn't necessarily put the words in, but you should be able to sort of include the start a bit, if I was you, ... somewhere in threat intel. You can't sort of make demands and say I feel like it's incredibly high priority. Also, separating your opinions from your facts. This was reported by this organization, we have a medium confidence that it's accurate, or in many cases even just saying I think I've provided a lot of value before by saying, here's something that someone said, I think it's totally made up. Just because you're also sort of going, here's something that you shouldn't worry about chasing your tail on because it's unlikely to be accurate. And you've got to know what you know and know what you think, and be clear between the two in your writing. Sort of talk about things like likelihood. Very rarely is there anything that you know to be true. It might have a high probability of being accurate, but especially if it's coming from another party. Things like double reporting, been a lot. It's we're panicking because we've heard from 4 different people about this particular type of attack today that have all messaged us. If all 4 of them heard it from the same person and then just shared it on because they wanted to help, then they've just amplified the message. Someone made a mistake, but you've heard it from 4 partners, so you're batten down the hatches. This is happening all over the place. So you got to know what you know and know what you don't know, to paraphrase Rumsfeld, I guess. I think initially, it's a pretty difficult thing to start, and the one that I tend to focus on for people is assuming that you've got a security operations center, and most places I would say that, sake of argument, you've got a medium-sized or large organization, you've got 3,000 alerts coming in each day from your SIEM tools or whatever you're using for alerting, your EDR tools, CrowdStrike or whatever. You're getting a bunch of alerts coming in. How are you prioritizing them? If you've got, say, 5 analysts working on it, you've got, say, 2,000, 3,000 alerts, your staff can't do that many. It doesn't work that way. You can't do 400 alerts a day with any sort of, thinking involved. So how do you prioritize these alerts? You're doing it chronologically, alphabetically, just whatever the person happens to pick off the top when they first go back to check. Either way, you're going to end up with hundreds, if not thousands, left at the end of the day. So if you can use your threat intelligence program to do some sort of enrichment so that you actually can identify things that are the, oh no, panic, hit the big red button, or if you can categorize the alerts that you're seeing into we know what that is, it's a systemic problem, but we're okay with dealing with it later. Ultimately, it's about sort of clustering things together. So instead of looking looking at 3,000 individual alerts, you're maybe looking at 10 classes of alert, or you can sort of group them by what the problem is. Or this is to do with our password policy. This is something that's mistuned, and we need to go back and deal with that later. Or these ones might be a valuable alert, but we don't have the telemetry that we need to actually do something about it. Being able to sort of uplift the data, and even if it's like antivirus alerts, like what does that alert likely mean? Is it something we need to actually do something about, or is it effectively maybe not a false positive, but something that we know is extremely low impact? So being able to provide that to what you're seeing right now means that you've actually got the ability to get intelligence on what's happening inside your organization and to your organization, rather than the biggest mistake people fall into is they end up chasing APT, advanced persistent threats. They're looking at the sort of apex predators, the fancy bears and cozy bears and comic crew and whatever else, all of these sort of glamorous attackers. And I often liken it to people like, say, if you're interested in self-defense, because you're concerned about someone attacking you, and you start watching a lot of old like VHS tapes of Mike Tyson in the 1990s, and you go, oh, okay, when he's tired, he drops his left a bit, and like you might learn some general ideas about boxing from watching old videos of Mike Tyson, but like you're not going to get in the ring against Mike Tyson. He's not the sort of person that you need to be concerned about. You're worried about just trying to protect yourself, trying to not get hit in the head, trying to spot someone that's acting sus in the car park. And a lot of people are very focused on those reading reports which are firstly, they're historical. They're nearly always from at least 6 months to a year ago. Secondly, they're an organization that had someone who was big enough to invest the marketing to write a white paper on exactly what happened. And thirdly, like it's got to be interesting enough for someone to bother writing it up. You will read about like some amazing new attack from the Turla threat actors, but you won't read about some 16-year-old Moldovan kid who logged in using a well-known password into someone's network and just encrypted their file share in SharePoint. And that's a lot more likely going to be what you see. That's sort of, you need to look at the sort of broader, more applicable things rather than the minutiae of what is happening in the big end of town. It's a lot more glamorous, but it's not as useful. In some cases, you might look at once you get to a degree of aptitude, you might look at the types of techniques they're starting to use, because those will flow down to lesser threat actors. Or, maybe you do realize that if you're, say, a university, I have a lot of respect and to some degree pity for universities, because say they are seeing attacks where someone's trying to get phishing of their credentials, and even if it's from Iran, well, that could be an APT attack trying to steal access to confidential research on material science or chemistry or something. It could be people from an embargoed country trying to get access to library accounts to be able to look at scientific journals because they're not able to get them locally. It could be effectively both, where it's someone who is a student during the day who moonlights doing a bit of state-sponsored threat activity. So it's useful to understand the types of techniques they're using, but getting fixated on those top-tier actors is definitely something that people fall into. And it's not a useful way to try and manage your time and resources. Ultimately, you want something that you can action, and just saying, here's what some big scary threat group's doing is not actionable for the most part. Key staff is difficult. You need good support from management. You need the ability to, I guess, bear with the pain of not being able to pull those people into things, but it's ultimately sort of a bit about tenacity and political capital in the people who are driving the threat intel program to make sure that those staff aren't sort of stolen here and there and having their time eroded and their focus eroded. And just finding staff is difficult in itself. Quite often the best people are people who know how things in your organization work, as well as having the sort of the hard techie cyber side of things or having previous experience. And those types of people are, you're taking them from somewhere else ultimately if they're already internal, or trying to recruit is hard anyway, but trying to recruit someone who can actually do intel things broadly is very difficult. Even inside government, most people deal with a segment of intelligence. They might be in the collection side or on the analysis side. Someone who's in a small team and doing it all is a bit of a change for a lot of those people. And to be honest, we're not like America, where they have like large bodies with thousands of people who are doing this day in, day out and providing a pool of talent. Australia's relatively small in this regard, so sometimes you need to sort of take the risk of growing someone who has an interest in it, who's perhaps already inside your security team, and growing them into being an intel person rather than being able to sort of hire one direct off the market. Absolutely. There's sort of two ways that people tend to go with it, and both of which in isolation are a bit of a mistake. There's either being extremely executive focused, where you're just chasing the news and sort of saying, here's what we've read about today, look at this. Or alternatively, they're curating a bunch of IP addresses and hashes and so on and giving them through to the security team in their SOC. And in both cases, you've got one sort of stakeholders that are sort of left on their own and they're not getting any value from it. The other big one is being actionable, and that's a key part of any intelligence program, is you have to be able to be actionable. If the response to everything is, well, that's nice, or thanks, then you can't really demonstrate any value. You're just letting people know what a problem is, but they don't really have any ability to do something about it. And that's a real challenge that most people face. Usually what we tell people to do, and it's a pretty awkward sort of sales discussion. When we first talk to people about doing threat intel, we sort of say, close your eyes, imagine you've reached nirvana, you've got the ultimate threat intel program, what outcomes are you getting from it? And then work your way backwards. Go, okay, here's the outcome, we're using it to do blah. Okay, so in order to do that, what type of delivery do we need to be doing? In terms of, does it need to be short form? Does it need to be quick? Who does it go to? In order to be able to do that, what sort of analysis resources do we need? And then sort of from that, what sort of data curation or tooling do we have? And what sort of collection of we got, and then also who can set that tasking. So if you work your way sort of backwards through the intelligence timeline and you focus on like how you're going to use this and how do you make it timely, and sort of go backwards, whereas a lot of people tend to go forwards, where they sort of decide that they're going to start with a certain data source and then work out what they can do with it. If they've got unique data sources, that can be great, but generally speaking, people need to, I guess, start at what their destination should be and work their way back, whether it's keeping executives engaged in what the security team is dealing with, so that, when security in a lot of organizations is a team that rocks up every couple of years and says, hi, cap in hand, can I have $3 million, please? And then the next thing you hear about them is when there's some terrible incident that's befallen your organization. It's useful being able to do like sort of almost PR style things. Here's what's out there, here's what we're seeing, and we're dealing with it. It's all good. It sort of shows that people are getting value for money and keeps security front of mind and gives them a bit of a seat at the table. You can't always be doom and gloom. You have to be saying, here's the thing, you might have heard about it, it's not that bad, and stuff like that. So that definitely helps with people setting their program and just generally bringing everyone along for the ride. You can be a great resource for getting security out there and helping different teams talk to each other, but you need to be able to work with your colleagues, and you can't be all secret squirrel about it and keeping it to yourself and not sharing. In some cases, you need to keep things confidential, but you also need to be able to collaborate with other teams. If you're just like the people who go off and hide and don't tell anyone what you're doing, ultimately you're just not going to have the support you need internally. Security architects are a great starting point. Usually security architects are more experienced security people, but in some cases their knowledge is perhaps a little, not so much dated, but it's coming from when they were sort of hands-on tools. So keeping them updated with what you're seeing out there, what's happening, because they're the ones who are designing the security controls for the systems that are coming in soon or as part of uplifts. When you're focusing on the detection side, and by all means, it's useful to work with a SOC team, but they don't have the ability to impact the design. And ultimately, most of these things are usually better factored in at design time. It's quite hard to retrofit. Say you decide that, mobile phone porting is a big problem that you're seeing at the moment. Being able to get the security architects to go and fight for saying, we need to have push notifications for our second factor instead of using SMS. If they can do that, and that's a design decision, it's no extra effort, it just happens early on, it's a lot better than trying to change the course of something that's already live and get people who enrolled via a different mechanism and so on. So yeah, architects are a great spot. Just generally keeping executives and risk people involved, not so much from a directly actionable, like I'm not expecting them to do something about a particular vulnerability, but having an awareness of the threat groups, thinking about what types of things they care about. And the other one is like what threat actors think about is not and care about is not necessarily what you care about. You might be, say, doing medical imaging and have a bunch of confidential health records of people with cancer. Someone's probably more likely to just want to go and encrypt all your files and demand $20,000 to get them back. They're not necessarily looking to capitalize on the private information. That's what you care about, absolutely, but they don't even care what the data is. So sort of getting that, a lot of people fall into the trap of going like, well, why would anyone bother attacking me? Who would care about me? And when you can sort of inform them like it can be anyone, they don't care about you necessarily, it's just a general here's the top. It lets you bring that other perspective of what you're seeing out there to the management, to risk people, to the people who are doing the planning, so they can factor that in rather than strictly sticking to what they feel is important about your organization. tough. Working out how effective you are, because you're ultimately trying to, if you're managing to shape the direction of your security program sort of early on in the piece, you aren't really going to be seeing those outputs. You're not going to be able to see the value that you provide because the thing's never happened. It's the same as any other sort of security thing. If you're doing a great job, no one really sees you potentially because, you didn't have to save the day because everything was, done beforehand. I think in terms of metrics and stuff, it's really hard. One thing I think people can tune is the way that they do the delivery of their intelligence product. So it might be, say you are a company that does software and you're sort of providing intel on the sorts of software vulnerabilities that other people like you have been making, and you're trying to feed that back into your dev team so they don't make those errors. If you write like a fancy PDF and you've got lots of images and stuff in it, and then someone has to go and copy and paste those bits into Jira to be a user story that gets implemented, then that's a waste of time. You could just put it directly in their Jira and that'd be good. I certainly had the feedback when working in banking that writing briefings for executives at the time, and this maybe ages me a little, that the full lead needs to be visible on the first page of a BlackBerry when someone opens the email. If it was clicking through to a portal, they probably weren't going to click. Realistically, they're reading it on their way between meetings, and you want a paragraph that sort of gives here's what it's about, here's roughly where we're positioned, and sort of here's what needs to happen next, or whether there's going to be a call to action, all sort of right in the front, much like a news story. You can't sort of write a giant treatise on this and expect someone to read through it. You'd need to be able to sort of hit the key points within the first paragraph, because that's all someone's going to read between meetings, and if they need to, they can come back to it later or forward it on. But those sorts of things about delivery are relatively easy to try and tune and talk to get champions in the right areas who are willing to engage you to help you better do this, because people won't tell you if it's useless. Usually you just won't hear from them, so you need to sort of go and seek that feedback and be willing to incorporate that feedback, not being too hard-headed about it. But yeah, it's in terms of actual metrics, it's really tough. It's a lot more subjective, I think. Ultimately try and find someone who can be a champion internally. So there's things like, if you are a financial institution, you can join the FSISAC for a relatively modest amount, like a few $1,000s, and then they get a bunch of stuff from their peers elsewhere. That's a great way of them sort of getting started with getting input, because data feeds are expensive. They don't cover everything. You might be able to get them from your existing vendors. I'd say that generally collection is a problem, because you don't want to be spending all day every day trying to read blogs or reading Twitter to follow what's going on. You certainly need to have some sort of way of structuring it so that you can find things and correlate things. I've done it before, using basic tooling and trying to do it in my head, and it's nowhere to live. So I'd say that you want something to be able to curate those things. A lot of people use MISP, which, we do a bit of stuff with MISP. Yeti, some people use. There's a lot of commercial tools, but they tend to be sort of focused more at the top end of town. If nothing else, use a wiki. Don't overdo the feeds. You want to be able to, as I said, work out what your objectives are and then go from there, rather than sort of focusing so much on collecting all the data you can and trying to do something with it, because you'll just drown trying to drink from the fire hose. You need to work with data that you can actually derive some meaning from. You can store it sensibly, rather than having an inbox full of 100,000 emails you're never going to get a chance to do that are all unstructured. I think they help everyone. They're a force multiplier. You don't sort of need to be the hero that saves the day, but you're the one that people know that they can rely on and can confide in. I've seen plenty of threat intel programs, for instance, inside financial organizations, that will have a great relationship with the help desk or the incoming call center, because they're the ones that people start calling up, and it's something a bit odd. And maybe it doesn't exactly match the script of anything that they've seen before, but people are calling up talking about a strange type of behavior or something. If someone is engaged, they understand and go wait a minute, maybe the threat intel people would like to know about this. That type of interaction that they can help drive can be absolutely fantastic for an organization. I've had stuff where I told people about it. I was like, why didn't we get briefed on this? I was like, well, you did 3 weeks ago. So when you're that far ahead that you can actually potentially do something about it before it happens to you, that's fantastic. If you've got the ability, we talk about the sort of the information pyramid. So you've got data at the bottom, it's just bits and bytes. Then you go to information, where it's actually got some sort of structure or meaning to it. And then you go up towards knowledge, where we actually know, this threat group is using this particular tool. But then wisdom is what lets you actually predict what's going to happen. And at the point when you can predict the future, when you can see a pattern, and you can say with some degree of confidence, even knowing what your degree of confidence is vaguely, that like, I expect in 3 months this threat group is going to start targeting us because they're currently, I don't know, say going after Spain, and traditionally we see them go after, Spain, and then they move their way here, or things like that. Being able to actually predict in the future, or, like, you're never going to be like a sort of a crystal ball, and it's foolish to try and be. But when you can give a bit of an expectation on what is likely to happen, a lot of people fall into the case of going like, yeah, see, we knew about this 3 months ago. And it's like, but if you didn't tell anyone, does it matter? So, yeah, you need to sort of be telling people ahead of time. But, yeah, that's definitely a way of providing value and showing people that you know what you're talking about. And, just keeping everyone engaged is the main thing. The biggest problem is secrecy. Everyone sort of thinks that they're a spook, and it's not usually. And just working elsewhere with other organisations as well, working with your counterparts in, you might be competitors in business, but allies when it comes to security. So having good relationships, if you need to call someone one day, and like in a lot of places where I've helped out with intelligence programs, that's been a big part of my value, is I helped out other organisations. And then when the time comes that you need a hand, you can be like, hey, I've had times on a Friday night, I want someone to go and, get something looked at or get something knocked on the head. And I had people, I'd done the favour for them previously of a weekend, I'd looked into something or alerted them to something they didn't know about yet, and you can call in the favours. And that's a great spot for intelligence, to be able to sort of have that network of peers that you can work with in order to try and make things happen, whereas otherwise it wouldn't necessarily, as a cold call, it's pretty difficult. Be talking to a domain name registrar to say, hey, if you want something knocked out for fraud on a Saturday night, a lot of places don't work weekends. If you know people there, you can be like, hey, can you get this knocked on the head for me? Thanks. And when the time comes that they need some help with something in Australia, once again, I can sort of go and help them with it. So a lot of it's doing things for people that aren't directly in the interests of your organisation, but it pays off in terms of, getting that sort of that capital, and you can be the one that helps tie everything together and, ultimately, hopefully save the day. Tough gig trying to do threat intel. There's no clear, definite ways of doing it. Depends a lot on the organisation, what the organisation does, and a lot of it, honestly, is about being personable and being able to have good relationships with the right people in the right places in order to actually get an impact, because it doesn't matter if you're right, if everyone thinks you're an asshole and ignores you. So, you need to be able to maintain those relationships and also understand that other people have different priorities. A software team is all about, hitting that next release, or a project is, their KPI is, did they hit the release window and, without defects, not, did we incorporate these 4 things because, the threat intel team think we need to be worried about quantum security at the moment, so they have to change all of our cipher suites. Like, you've got to be aware of what matters to other people as well as you, and sort of temper your advice with that lens rather than alienating people, because that's definitely a trend in IT and InfoSec, and especially Intel, is alienating people by sort of thinking that you're always right, and you need to be humble and work with other people rather than trying to boss them around.